I always seem to get a lot of questions regarding our company's history. So this week I wanted to do something related to that, but just a little bit different. I want to share 4 lessons that I learned growing up in a family business. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I am your host, Scott Volquartsen, along with our Director of Marketing, Chad Wittrock. This week, we are going to go over 4 lessons that I believe were caught, not taught, growing up in the family business. How you doing today, Chad?
I'm doing great. This is a really cool topic. I think people are going to be excited to hear about it.
Well, I think it's one of those things, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs or a lot of questions that I get, growing up, we didn't, sit down and have like these family business planning sessions. It was just things that would come up during conversation at the dinner table. We may talk about Little League into what's going on in the shop, into what's going on a month from now, but it wasn't like these sit down mentorship business meetings in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget kind of the humble beginnings that the business started from. It's easy to picture buildings or conference rooms or whatever you might think, but the kitchen table was that.
The kitchen table was that. We had one phone that fed into both, one landline fed into both of our shop at the time as well as our house.
Oh, really? That I didn't know.
Yeah, it was always interesting. And, looking back, now we have cell phones attached to us all the time. People are calling all hours of the day. Mom and Dad were actually doing that long before cell phones were around because there was no caller ID. There was no way of knowing if it was, grandparents calling or a customer checking on an order. So and we grew up, that was perfectly normal the way we grew up.
So how did you have office hours? Did you guys have office hours?
We had quote unquote, they had quote unquote office hours. And once they started getting just a little bit busier and Dad was going to make it a full-time thing, we did end up having a separate phone line, which we thought was kind of a big deal because we were supposed to stay off the phone at the time because what if a customer was calling?
I was just going to say that. I bet when you added that phone, that was significant. I remember when we got internet and it was dial-up and you wanted to make sure you didn't tie up the phone. But then the idea of now, if you, even as a teenager, if someone had 2 phone lines, that was impressive.
Well, and we had to, same way with our internet, we ran that off of the second line because we couldn't tie up the primary line, which was at the time the only way customers, that and sending mail could get in contact with us.
So here's an important tech question about the business. When did you bring in the fax machine?
I would say I'm speculating here, probably the early 90s. we had one very early.
And for anyone wondering, we still have a fax line.
Yes, and for whatever reason, our industry sometimes likes to hold on to those things that, the rest of the business world has moved on, but for some reason, sometimes we like to hold on to those.
Yeah, we still get fax.
So,
yep. So I'm fascinated by this principle. Tell us a little more about this caught, not taught idea.
So yeah, I heard that stole that from somebody else, but they were just talking about how, many of the times the lessons that people try to teach us or we try to teach our kids or whoever, we think it comes from what we tell them when the reality of it is it comes from them watching our actions or us watching their actions.
Oh, okay. I like that.
So you catch that lesson versus anything they say, the expression obviously goes in one ear out the other, where when you see whatever might be being said be put to action is what really, at least for me, resonates. And I think with most people with how they're going to behave and, handle things. And the interesting thing for me on this is I learned, a lot of valuable lessons, obviously from both parents, but some of the business principles that I took away, I don't think they were doing it in a way that it was intended to be like, here, watch this. This is how we do this.
Oh, it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't being taught.
Right. It was the way they operated, and all they were doing is trying to get by day to day. They weren't, they didn't have this grand business plan. They were just in the middle of it, trying to make it work.
Sure. That's cool. That's awesome to hear.
So yeah, we kind of put this list together. I'll just get started, and then any questions, let me know, because like I said, I think this is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, so I'm curious to hear more.
So one of the first things that I learned was one of my very first SHOT Shows that I went to. I believe it was probably 1997, 98, somewhere in there. Is the lesson is always listen to the feedback from customers and do it from a place that you're willing to learn, not just trying to be, respectful to the person or whatever it might be.
And you just touched on this on the year-end email, I think.
Yes. And what I learned on this one is there was a gentleman that came up and had an idea that he thought would improve our trigger guard, our TG2000 that we make for the 1022. At the time, it wasn't even called a TG2000. It became that with this redesign. But basically, it was an improved way to reset the trigger, eliminating any interference with the trigger and plunger system that was so common for so long. Looking back, it was a very simple change. But I learned watching Dad, he picked up that this guy had a great idea, and the gentleman was not interested in selling it or anything like that. He just wanted to see this idea be put into manufacturing and, basically take credit for it.
Sure.
So what I learned through that, and learning it firsthand was, we got to be able to set our ego aside and realize that a lot of times there's a better way. But so many times, we get so caught up in this is the way we've always done it, or, we're so invested in that idea that it's hard to say, maybe that's not the best way and option B is.
And I think that even to further that point, he was able to put his ego aside and utilize the idea. I think it's hard to not want to. You could say, well, it's not my idea, so I want to wrench on this. I want to tweak it or change it enough so then I can say it's my idea, and then you're losing something.
Correct. And interesting enough, the final product was a slight redesign of what this gentleman brought to us.
Oh, okay.
But the premise was still based on his idea, so it's one we've always given credit to him.
For sure.
Because we would have never got
stepping stone.
Yeah, we would have never got to the final product without that being brought to us.
Oh, perfect.
And the interesting thing is sometimes I think we tell ourselves we don't want to do that because we wish we would have came up with it.
Yeah,
and we're almost mad at ourselves that something such a good, redesign or whatever it might be was not our idea. And, the other thing that I don't think a lot of people understand is, especially back then, marketing's a little more fluid now where you can change your website, you can change social media. But back then, the product had already been in the catalog, and that's a year-long process. We printed them once a year. We had ads taken out, different things. And even as so much as getting that information to our dealers and distributors, now we can shoot them an email and say, hey, here's what's changed. Here's the link to the new stuff. Back then, it was more a phone call, a letter, whatever it was, and say, hey, we've changed this. And that doesn't even count the changes you have to make in the shop to set up and try a new product.
You had to manufacture it. Yep.
Yes. But that story always sticks with me on, we are 25 years later from the time that was originally introduced, still using that variation or the variation of that design in all of our trigger groups that we sell on our rifles.
To this day, that's awesome.
To this day. So it's easy to keep that top of mind and be like, hey, it's okay to listen to other people, listen to customers. A lot of times they have really good ideas that we can implement.
Yeah, and like you touched on, if anyone checked out, I think the year-end email, I think you really got into that, how we really do take feedback to heart, and we look at it and we share it and we brainstorm off of it. So we appreciate all of that.
And that's one advantage of being a smaller company is we are able to pivot and shift much easier sometimes than a larger company or corporation can.
Absolutely.
And that was always something that Dad insisted, he liked to have that ability to pivot or change, without it being a very, drawn out process. And that's not to say we don't go through testing and our R&D and everything when we implement something like that, but we're able to shift much quicker than a larger company can.
Absolutely.
So on to point number 2 is, and this is actually one that I learned from, I didn't realize I was learning it. In fact, I probably made fun of her a lot over the years for it, but I learned from my mom is create a relationship-based business versus a transactional business.
That's a great one.
And, we hear a lot about that now, but growing up, we would listen to her on the phone and, the running joke when she got off a phone call would be like, what time are they coming over for dinner? This would happen time and time again. She knew everything about our customers, kids, the hunts they were going on, their occupation. And, so much so that years later, we had a customer drive from Florida. He brought shrimp, lobster, crab, and cooked it in our family's kitchen dinner. And at the time,
he cooked family dinner for you from Florida.
Yes.
Which also served as a conference room. So you could probably count it as a business meeting.
Yes. And as a kid, I would be like, I always thought, why are we spending so much time on the phone with that person? Or, why does that stuff matter? And all these years later, I'm like, that was, genius. And it wasn't, she wasn't doing it from a place of like a marketing gimmick.
Sure, she was sincere.
She was sincere. And to this day, she remembers these customers. She remembers what they did and all these different things. And if we go to a trade show, and I'm sure you've probably heard it, people will come up and they'll say, how's Linda doing? How's your mom doing? I remember this with her. I remember that with her. And
you definitely hear how Linda's doing.
Yes. And, she hasn't answered the phone in our offices in probably more than 20 years. And we still get a lot of that.
Well, I think even in the way we do things, in a lot of ways now, we try and say, well, the attention span's not there. Everything nowadays, give me, 5 or 7 seconds. So yeah, it's awesome that she was willing to take the time and build those relationships.
And I think to your point, that's something we try to do is take the time on, whether it's an email exchange or a phone call, take the extra time to talk to the customer, 1, to get to know them, but 2, in my opinion, you don't see it a lot because everybody's in such a rush and a hurry to get to the next phone call or the next email, that we've had customers, and this is a credit to our staff. This isn't, anything I've done, but it's a credit to them when they take the time, because then I'll get an email and say, hey, I spoke to person X on the phone today. I just want to say, I appreciate the extra time they took with me.
Sure.
So it's pretty cool to see that come full circle, from what many times mom would do, with her customers back in the 80s, 90s to what is going on today. And it's one of those things, and many of these principles, there are things that don't, regardless of everything that's changed in marketing, business, all that, they're things that stand the test of time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of them.
And yes, and now, you can read books and all these different things and do that. But back then, I think these are just things, they were doing it more of like a survival mechanism, trying to put, food on the table so they could feed their family of 6 and we could eat.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So the third point that I learned, and this one comes from Dad, is kind of stay in your lane with what you're doing. And that doesn't mean not to branch out and try different things, because obviously he did that and did it very well many times. But once he decided in the early 90s to go full force into the rimfire market, he was challenged many times. Well, what are you going to do once you saturate that market? What are you going to do? Or when are you going to go back to center fires? When are you going to build this? You're not going to make a living building rimfire only. You have to branch out. And he fought that resistance and decided our company's mission was going to be to build the best rimfires that we possibly could. And many times over the years, we've had people, when are you going to get into the AR market? And I won't lie, it's tempting, when you see the spikes of the AR sales for whatever political driven reason or whatever, not even political, but that market seems to ebb and flow much more than what ours does.
I mean, we even get asked about revolvers and 1911s.
Yes. And and with just trends and fads, at times, some of those there's a more popular market for that. And it's tough to say, well, we could easily do that.
Yeah, we could easily throw our hat in the ring there.
Yeah. But at the same point, if we don't have innovation to bring to it and we haven't maximized what we can do in the rimfire market, it's kind of straying from who we are and what we, kind of what we pride ourselves on.
Yeah, exactly. Then you worry about taking a step backwards in what you've done in the rimfire market, or not getting those customers or those products the attention they need.
Exactly. And I always kind of equate it to, if you go to the doctor and you have a heart issue, you go to a heart specialist. You don't go to your cardiologist to have your knee looked at. But like so many times in what we do in our industry, people want to be like the jack of all trades and an expert on every area. Mm-hmm. And that many times that's just not possible. And that's not to take away from some of the guys that are excellent and true gunsmiths to the, every sense of the word and can work on everything. But I don't think you can, there's not enough, I don't think somebody has enough bandwidth to focus on all areas.
Well, even from the manufacturing
and
side.
Do it at the top level.
Yeah, I would completely agree.
I know on here we've talked, and I've talked a lot about like fitness and training. It's kind of the same thing. If you're trying to play in the NFL, that's a different level trainer and different specialist than you need if you're a middle-aged, somebody that needs to drop 30 pounds.
Yeah, totally different approach.
Yeah, different approach, different genetics, different plan, everything. So that's why we try to stay in our lane. And it's something that, I learned from them even as they were challenged to get into different markets. And we've been challenged over the years that if we continue to do that and continue to innovate and try to be the best in the rimfire game, it will serve us well.
Absolutely. It can be hard to do, but it's absolutely worth doing.
Yes. And point number 4, and this is one that we probably heard. This is one that was both caught and taught because we heard this over and over again is don't ever sacrifice quality for quantity or lead time. And we have to be careful not to let that become a crutch that at one point, our lead times are so far out there that we almost justified it from a quality perspective.
Oh, you're saying, well, it's that far because we're that good at quality assurance.
And, we had to take a hard look and realize a lot of that was just due to production issues we needed to fix.
Oh, sure. So there's a compromise. There's a
compromise there, but at the very root of it, we are still, quality is going to be our primary driver. And growing up, I would always hear this because Dad was known at the time for doing a lot of different things. He was one of the first ones to kind of really incorporate different colors and, just as I've said on the podcast before, one of his competitors referred to him as the king of weird, just that he would always do some different things.
His work would stand out. He had an art background, correct?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
He did have an art background, and that's where a lot of that came from. But what he would always stress to us is performance, accuracy, all that is still at the top of the pyramid. Once that is taken care of, then you can go and try to figure out how to make it look better, from an aesthetic standpoint.
Sure, and that makes a lot of sense too.
But that at no time could appearance, cosmetics, whatever you want to call it, trump the product that had to be put out there.
Yeah, and that would never trump accuracy and performance.
No, and many times and we still do it this way today, when we design a product, it's not designed with an end cost in mind. We design the product for what we think will solve a problem or, improve an area of something that we're doing. And then we work backwards and say, okay, what's it going to cost us to manufacture this? is there a market for this, or how can we market this? And that all comes from, growing up in that same arena where you design the product first and then work everything else backwards from there.
Right. That's awesome.
And once again, this was met with a lot of challenges over the years, because when, like, for the younger people, it's going to be hard, and I've said this many times, it's hard to believe there was a time before, like, all these 1022 accessories were available. But when I say we, meaning mom and dad, but when they started doing the 1022 aftermarket parts, our barrels cost 2 to 2.5 times what a factory 1022 did.
As a complete rifle.
So there was a lot of, from dealers, well, that's a great product, but it'll never sell. Nobody will ever do that.
It's too expensive. They won't want to spend that. Yep.
Yeah. It's a, $100 rifle. Who's going to spend $225 on a barrel? So there was a lot of persistence, and thankfully they were persistent and stayed with it, but there was never the idea of how can I manufacture this barrel, or could I get by with a barrel almost as good that I could sell for a lot less? That never even, at least to my knowledge, never became a discussion.
Because, that had to be hard for your dad if they're saying, this is too expensive, to instantly be like, okay, where can I cut a cost corner a little bit and maybe get this down to a little more reasonable price point? Can it be, maybe it's not quite as accurate, or maybe it's not quite as well built. That's tough, I think, to really be true to yourself and hang in there through that kind of feedback.
And I'm sure it was tough, especially when, when times were very difficult and trying to get off the ground. I'm sure the idea crept in of, what if we just compromise now? And then once we kind of get some traction, then we'll start ramping up the quality. But thankfully, that's not the way they thought, and they stuck with their, principles the entire way. And that's the one thing that, kind of related to that I'm proud of is, my brother and I are second generation, but that to this day, we're still family, obviously family owned, but family run, because it allows us to operate that way. I see a lot of times where, outside money is great to take, and it helps build and grow a company. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, once you get too many investors, from different things I've heard and just my own opinion, things start to be driven more by your P&L than they do the quality of the product you're putting out there.
Yeah, there's things to answer for.
There's things to answer for, and all of a sudden it's, and like I said, I've never been in that situation, but I assume at that point it's much easier to start saying, well, we'll compromise here because that's going to satisfy this side.
Absolutely.
So we've been able to stick to that, which allows us to kind of use these 4 principles that mom and dad have instilled in us.
Yeah, for sure. So, and kind of running through them at the very top level, do you want to recap kind of what those 4 main ideas have been?
Yeah. Number 1, always listen to feedback from customers, and do it from a place of being willing to improve and, realizing there's a better way out there. Number 2 was create a relationship-based business versus transactional. And in today's world, it's easy, with all the technology that's out there. But like I heard somebody put it, nobody's going to out Amazon. So we'll let them have the transaction-based business, and we'll stick to relationship-based. And number 3 was, stay in your lane, which I think kind of speaks for itself and something we're proud that we've always done. And then number 4 was, don't ever sacrifice quality for quantity or a lead time.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly.
And I'm not saying it's the right way. It's the only way we know.
And how we'll keep going.
And we're going to keep going, and hopefully it keeps working out.
Agreed.
So if you guys ever have any more questions about how we got started, what we've done, where we're headed, please don't hesitate to hit us up at podcast@volquartsen.com. And as always, thank you for listening.